Okay, hello, my name is Jack Disher, and this is my submission for the first assessment in Mind, Brain and Behaviour 1 of 2017. The exercise is titled, How Does the World Change as the Light Changes? And I have here a mind map that details my experience of the sunset, which I will commentate and have my tutor watch as a video submission. Fantastic, let's get started. Firstly, I will address an important branch that I consider to be a significant point to raise, and that is complications up here in the top right hand corner. The first complication was my location. So I watched this sunset on the South Lawn at the University of Melbourne, and therefore had lots of distractions that could have affected my observations. The task specifically mentions to sit as far away from artificial light sources as possible, which I was not actually able to do, and in turn, I had lots of light pollution that influenced my experience of the sunset. Indeed, things like the massive and extremely well-lit Behaviour Library, which was right in front of me and under the setting sun, as well as surrounding classrooms and buildings and the lights involved, all served as light pollution and context, which was an idea that Simon Cropper addressed in our sensation and perception lectures. They would all certainly have influenced my perception of colours throughout the observation period. So just think of the example of the dress and how the context of a coloured background and the background of which you viewed the dress could drastically affect how we perceive the colours that were involved. Okay, cool. Second, I'm colorblind, specifically red-green colorblind. So this would have drastically influenced my perception of the sunset again, and especially these two important sunset colors, such as the red in the sky and the green of the grass and the leaves. So this is something to keep in mind and could be a possible explanation for any unique observations in color that I may have had throughout the sunset. That were not observations shared by my colleagues, which was something I did actually notice during a tutorial when we shared our findings with our classmates. Interestingly though, there are a number of claims that people with colourblindness actually have a greater sense of sight in low light and at night time, but I couldn't find any concrete evidence to either prove or disprove these claims, and I don't have any personal identification with them. So it's possible that colour deficient people might actually have a better night vision, or it may just be that those people feel like their night vision is better simply because what they're accustomed to is less than their non-colourblind counterparts. Regardless, it is an interesting thought and something that I was very cognizant of throughout these observations. And the last complication was that I do have poor vision, and I wasn't wearing glasses at the time, which could be an extraneous variable to explain many of the difficulties I actually experienced with form and distance as the sun went down, and they're issues I'll cover later in this video. Okay, so let's just get straight into it with my findings. Firstly, I'll start with the biggest branch that makes up most of what we associate with sunsets, and that's colour. I made sure to take down and observe times, as the progression and scattering of colours was an interesting feature of the sunset across the period. So at 6:10, there was a faded light blue/grey hue that washed over the top of the Behaviour Library and throughout the point of the horizon. And then there was a soft yellow that fell behind this blue hue and almost layered above the horizon. These were two significant shades throughout the whole experience, although they started quite gentle and soft and deepened later on, as I will show now. So across the 10 minutes from 6:15 to 6:25, the blue hue became darker and much stronger, and spread throughout the sky, until it slowly developed into a deeper violet. Here I've included a note of the quickness of darkening in the east away from the sunset, as opposed to the west where the sun actually goes down. Ultimately, the sky became much darker more quickly towards the east, away from the setting sun, whereas the yellow tinge naturally lingered around the west. Lastly, at around 6:35, and within the last 10 minutes before the sun completely set and nighttime kicked in, the sky became overwhelmed with a dark purple/blue and even with a grey blend. But importantly, there was almost no white shades left that were there when the sun was up. So across the time period, ultimately everything darkened, a blue took over, it developed into a bit of a violet-y colour, and the white shades almost completely left the sky, I suppose developing into a dark nighttime. Also, outside of these time-sensitive details, colours just gradually became less vivid overall. So for example, my tan shorts that I had on became unrecognisable as tan, and were almost colourless, although I was cautious not to discredit the idea of my colour deficiencies playing a role in this. And then also the green of the grass and the trees became a dark brown, which borderlined on black towards the end of the sunset. So following this line, the health of the grass became more difficult to identify as the sun went down, as I didn't have those green colours, and more importantly, the green shades that come with those, to use as a reference to work out health. In all, this ability to use references in our environment is an essential theme of my findings, and you'll notice I mentioned it a lot throughout this video, as I understand it to be important that as it got darker, my brain became much less adept at making predictions or assumptions about its environment and what I was looking at, as it had much less to go off, I suppose. Cool, so here I'd like to just change to a picture that I made. So keep in mind that I'm by no means an artist, but I've tried to create a pictorial diagram of what I've just gone through. So the X down the bottom here marks where I was sitting on the south lawn, facing the Bailey Library up above, which I've drawn in to try and highlight all the light that was coming from it and the effect that it had on the environment. And then up above it, I've written in the effect of the sky and the colours that were permeating. So particularly lower down around the top of the library and across the horizon, there was a blue light of the late evening sun that scattered out across this point. And then there was also a yellow tinge, as I've mentioned, that seeps in and blankets that blue outline. So next I've made sure to detail where the sun was setting and the fact that this area seemed to be the center for everything that was happening. As I felt that it felt like everything was being dragged to this point. So particularly all the colors especially. And lastly, I drew a few trees in to highlight the importance they had as markers for color loss, because they were the quickest things I noticed to lose their shade and turn a dark brown grey blend and almost black eventually. Cool, so we're changing back here and moving on to the third branch, which is called form. So under this form bracket, I included motion and shape as well to encompass all of the three-dimensional world that I was experiencing. And I noticed some interesting things. So first of all, edges became much softer. For example, the walls or outlines of buildings became much more rounded and gentle, particularly the skyscrapers that were actually further away from me. So this links back to the distance and the effects that distance have on detail under low light conditions. So further, sensory information felt much less harsh. This is really just reiterating the first point that I made under form, that everything was much less strict and sharp overall. And lastly, shapes became much harder to discern. So especially at a distance, again, I evidence all of these points using the example of my laptop, which sat on my knees to take notes on. So as the sun went down, the shape and outline of my laptop gradually softened, and the usual familiarity of the keys became much less sure in my mind, which was maybe an interesting effect of my brain as the light went down. Our fifth bracket here, I addressed depth, and more specifically my depth perception. So this branch relies on the ideas I've already mentioned about the ability of the brain to reference the environment or to make out assumptions about what we're looking at. For instance, distance became much harder to both recognize and predict. For example, it was a little difficult to work out a group of students who were walking towards me and stood right in my line of vision, both in terms of whether or not they were actually a group of human beings, and also how far away they stood from me. So moving on, slope was actually harder to make out, probably because much of the shadows that the brain usually uses to identify gradients had been taken away, leaving only experience and predictions to work it out for themselves. So think of the slope of the grass or the slope of a pathway as it gets darker for yourself, and how much harder this is to work out just how strict that gradient is. And cool, so lastly, we move on to the final branch, which is senses. So with this one, I've included mood and feeling and looked at it in a more subjective way rather than thinking about the scientific underlines and effects of the senses during low light conditions. So addressing these points, I've written that as the colours became warmer and darker and the environment dimmed as a result of this darkening, the mood became more soothing overall than what it had been earlier. Now obviously this would also have been due to the fact that there was far less people around and that activity had slowed down, but nonetheless it was a significant feeling that was evident to me immediately. And finally, a significant idea that could obviously be explored in much more detail, but I actually noticed my hearing improved, so particularly my ability to pick out smaller sounds that otherwise perhaps would have gone unnoticed in the middle of the day in full light. Again, I was careful to consider whether this was because of the light and my ability to see decreasing, and my other senses heightening, or whether or not it wasn't just because of the fact that many of the other noises that are rampant during the middle of the day at uni were actually taken away that would have otherwise masked these smaller, more particular sounds that I was now picking up. Nonetheless, this concludes my findings. I've gone over all the branches, and I hope this summarizes my experiences and observations of the sunset. I hope I provided a subjective and personal account as per the instructions of the exercise. So thank you for listening, and this is me signing off.